We're going to be talking about code breaking, and this is a very, very short introduction. If I had to put a percentage on it, I'd say we're talking about a 0.5% of what there is to really talk about. But this is what we have to deal with right now. So I'm going to continue on here. Um, the story is very simple. If you're playing poker and you can peek at your opponent's cards, you have a hell of a better chance of winning. And so this briefing is going to talk about how countries have historically devised schemes to protect their communications, and then how these schemes were defeated. And specifically, we're going to talk about World War II, although there's much more involved than just World War II to get there. Uh, Again, because of the group we're talking to, I don't need to talk about code breaking. Most of you understand what cryptanalysis is. What I did want to say is that, as I said before, the little that is known by a lot of people is many times incomplete, and much was classified, believe it or not, until the 1970s. And I believe that there are portions that are still classified. I can't be sure, but I believe there are some things they still do not talk about. There's an interesting saying from Winston Churchill after World War II. He said, "In war, the truth is so precious that it must always be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies." And there is nothing that I've ever heard that's truer than that statement. So we're going to talk about four things really: cryptography, cryptanalysis, provide a very brief introduction and history, and we'll describe cryptanalysis a little bit during World War One, and specifically during World War II. And then I'd like to talk about a little about the quantum leaps that have had since World War II. And of course, we can't go into modern day stuff or military grade encryption because that obviously would not be possible. Uh, this page is for those people who don't know about encryption. I'm sure everybody here knows about encryption. However, not everybody fully understands the difference between a cipher and a code. Codes deal with words or phrases. You might have the letters AXQUB might mean attack at dawn, where ciphers deal with letters. And most of what we're going to be talking about here is ciphers, although occasionally I slip and I use the word code, but we're going to be talking about ciphers for the most part. Um, Definitions that I use here: cryptography is the science of encryption, cryptanalysis is the science of breaking codes without knowing the key, and cryptology combines both of those. Cryptography has been around in simple forms literally for centuries. Its first use was in military when commanders needed to send commands to field units and receive status messages, and they had to do that securely. And the first established use that we know of in cryptography was in the 5th century BCs when the Spartans actually used it. Um, I think I screwed up. Here we go. Now, the first attested use of cryptography comes from Julius Caesar for political use. Caesar wrote to his friends in a cipher, and what he did is he took every letter in the plain text and moved it 3 letters over. So when he wanted to write the letter A, he wrote the letter D. When he wanted to write the letter B, he wrote the letter E, C, F, and so forth. So every letter was shifted 3 characters. On the other end, of course, they just had to shift it to the other direction. This was a pretty good cipher until the Arabs figured out how to break it. And they were the first to discover and to write down the methods of cryptanalysis. And what they did, and the way a lot of it is done today, they look at letter frequencies, and they looked at the letter frequencies in the Quran and they looked at which letters appear and do not appear together. Okay? In English, we have obviously about 12% of letters are the letter E. The next one is the letter T, A, and so forth on down the line. So if you have a document, a long document, and the letter Q is the most used letter in that long document, there's a pretty good chance that it's the letter E or perhaps the letter T. Now, another thing that they did is they looked at what letters touch other letters. So if you look at the letter T as an example, the most common use of a letter after the letter T is probably going to be the letter H, maybe E, but you're not going to find the letter M after the letter T. So they can discount a lot of combinations simply by if they know one letter, they know what letters cannot follow that letter. And every single language has this kind of a frequency distribution. Modern cryptology starts with the Civil War, which is when it was used, but it played only a minor role. Intercepting a coded message meant you either had to physically intercept the courier or you had to tap a telegraph line. And both of those things are difficult to do. In the First World War, there was an interesting situation. World War One was not a mobile war. If you remember what you've learned about it, there were trenches, and the trench would move a few feet in one direction, a few feet in the other direction, but basically it was a stalemate. And so they could use wires to get messages back and forth, and they really didn't have to worry too much about cryptography. Now, during World War One, the United States was an observer for the most part. People in America said, that's a European war. We don't want to get involved. Now, what I'm going to tell you is a very, very oversimplified version of how we got into World War One, but that story is so complex that it could take a 15 to 20-minute discussion. So, in an oversimplified version, the English people or the English country intercepted an encrypted telegram that came from Germany to Mexico. And in that telegram, Germany stated they were going to institute unrestricted submarine warfare, and that would probably cause the U.S. to enter the war. So what they wanted Mexico to do was to make war with the United States. In other words, keep the United States occupied so they wouldn't be able to interfere in Europe. And their plan was make war together, put peace together. And they promised that when they won that war, they would give Mexico about 3 or 4 of the southern states of America to annex onto Mexico. And they also promised financial aid. Well, when that decrypted telegram was published, that changed the American feeling about going into World War One. So we entered World War One, and as most of you know, we actually changed the outcome of that war. If we had not entered it, things might have been completely different. World War II was different. By that time, we had radio, and radio was a real game changer because now you could coordinate the control of armies and navies together, and you could make a mobile war out of this. The problem was all of your communications could now fall into the hands of the enemy. So the only practical way for military to use radio was to encrypt the messages. World War II was the first truly mobile war, and during that war, the use of radio literally exploded. And Germany, more than any other country, needed to use radio to coordinate the blitzkrieg. For us, Britain was key to winning World War II. Most of Europe was under Nazi control after 1939, and the German U-boats were squeezing the life out of Britain. Britain is an island nation, and they're dependent upon imports for both food as well as raw materials for the military. And during the early part of that war, 50% of all ships carrying supplies were being sunk by the submarines. We had to keep Britain free from German occupation because we had to get troops onto England in order to prepare for D-Day. You could not have had D-Day from the United States. We had to get tons and tons of material into England to prepare for D-Day. And without that safe staging area for men and materials, D-Day would have been impossible. Winston Churchill, after the war, said that the Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor throughout the entire war. That was the single key to winning the war, and nothing else at sea or in the air mattered the way the Battle of the Atlantic mattered. Now, Germany used radio to intercept the supply convoys. They had what they called wolf packs, and they would get as many as 30 to 40 submarines stationed together. Because remember, we used convoys. One submarine, I think a sub carried only about 12 torpedoes, and maybe that could bring down one or two boats. But we had convoys of 30 and 40 boats. So they had to get 30 and 40 submarines together with the hopes of sinking the entire convoy. Please excuse the typo in here. But by breaking the naval cipher, we could route our convoys around the waiting U-boats. And they did this in several ways. First, they broke the cipher that Germany used, but they also had, by that time, very, very sophisticated radio direction finders, and they could pinpoint where the subs were. Every sub had to report in every single day back to headquarters, their status and where they were located. And once, of course, we knew their locations, either through cryptanalysis or radio direction finding, we had hunter-killer destroyers that were designed specifically for detecting and destroying submarines. The easiest of the ciphers that Germany used to break was the Luftwaffe. We had broken, that was the first one, and they were, of course, they had the Blitz. They were bombing England left and right, but because we could read their ciphers and we had radar and we could tell where they were heading and when they were heading, and England was able to conserve their fighter pilots and planes so that they never completely ran out, although they did run pretty dry pretty quickly. Germany's preparations for D-Day were sent by radio, and that is what guided the Allies in their preparations. In a little while, we're going to talk about another cipher that Hitler used, and we broke that cipher only days before D-Day, but we were confident that we knew that Germany was deceived about our landing plans, and we could proceed with D-Day. There was a very, very significant deception where we wanted Germany to believe that the invasion was going to come at the Pas-de-Calais, about 40 miles north of Normandy, and we had a major deception planned with General Patton, as a matter of fact, to convince Hitler that the invasion, which he knew was coming, was going to be at the Pas de Calais. If the war in the Atlantic or the D-Day landings had failed, there is no question that the war probably would have been lost, because Britain was starving for food and supplies, and we could not have had a D-Day invasion without a massed of troops and equipment in Britain. So if Hitler had succeeded in conquering Great Britain, World War II probably would have ended with a German victory. Cryptanalysis was the essential element in winning all of these battles. And I'm just going to talk about a specific, get to some specifics here. There's a battle called Kursk, which was the largest tank battle in history. It was the turning point of the war in the East. Germany planned to attack the town of Kursk in Russia. England learned of that, warned Russia, and Russia was prepared, and they routed the Germans. I believe there were 2,000 tanks involved in the Battle of Kursk. Now, on the other side of the earth, we were also fighting Japan. And in Japan, we were fighting pretty much alone. In Europe, we were fighting with other countries, but not in Japan. We were alone. So most of the fighting was done by us. And the breaking of the Japanese codes was enabled us to win the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was the turning point in the war. Prior to Midway, Japan was winning. They have won virtually every single battle. After Midway, they were on the defensive, and they lost virtually every single battle. We knew the exact date, time, and place of their surprise attack, and we were waiting for them in ambush. It turns out they were the ones that were surprised. We lost one carrier. They lost all four of theirs, three of them within 5 minutes of each other, and one was a couple of hours later. And we could rebuild our carriers. We could repair them. We could rebuild them. They did not have the industrial capacity to replace those carriers. And as I said before Midway, they were on the offense. After, they were on the defense. An interesting point. Yamamoto was the one that planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he was the dominant figure in the Japanese Navy. He was educated at Harvard, and he was very aggressive, determined, and very, very smart. And he devised bold and imaginative plans. He was a very strong leader. In the spring of 1943, he was coming down to the island of Rabaul to take personal charge of a deteriorating situation that was happening in the Solomon Islands. He planned to be there one day to, up morale and do an inspection tour. And of course, the bases would have to be alerted that he was going to be there. And they broadcast Yamamoto's itinerary in code. Yamamoto was known to be extremely punctual, down to the minute. And that was key to killing him. We broke their code. We were listening to his planned activities, and our decoded intercept amounted to his death warrant. And this was a psychological victory, because the death of the commander-in-chief would demoralize the Chinese, who venerated their captains much more than Occidentals do. And we eliminated the finest strategist of the enemy war machine, and that equaled a major American battle victory. And this is a true statement. The higher up in the political and military realm or the events, the more important is cryptanalysis. At the front, it probably stands equal with prisoners of war intelligence or aerial reconnaissance, but neither of these can match it for providing insight into the strategic plans of top generals or the basic diplomatic policy of an entire country. That's where it's most important. Intelligence chiefs love cryptanalysis because it's the cheapest, the latest, and the truest source of information. Cryptanalysis can alter the status quo. Cryptography can at best conserve it. So you can't change the status quo by making codes, but you can change the status quo by breaking them. Prior to World War II, encryption was done manually by pencil and paper. The encoder had to perform some arithmetic operation on code numbers before the message could be transmitted. It was obviously very labor intensive and very slow. World War II was the very first war that made widespread use of cipher machines, which greatly increases the complexity of ciphers, and it was originally thought that breaking machine-generated ciphers was impossible. And that, to some degree, is true, as we're going to see shortly. In the mid-1920s, a company came out with an electromechanical cipher machine not designed for the military. It was designed for businesses, banks, brokerage houses, people that dealt in high finances. They needed to encrypt their communications. And the Enigma was the invention that they had, and that was sold all over the world. It wasn't just a German thing. We had copies of it. Everybody had copies of it. They were commercially available, and they were adopted by both military and government services in several countries. And like most of the machines of that era, they were based on a rotor principle. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the function of the rotors is to scramble the plain text letter into multiple ciphertext letters each time the plain text letter is used in the message. So, for example, the first time the letter N is pressed, it may come out as an X. The next time, it may come out as a B, and the next time, a Q. So therefore, even though you're encoding the letter N, it never shows up the same twice within the message. Or if it does, it's random when it does. The German military models used 3 rotors and added a plug board to significantly increase the complexity of the encryption. The German Navy later on added a 4th rotor to increase the complexity even more. And these were the most complex type of Enigmas produced. Now, originally, the Enigmas had 3 rotors, and those rotors can be taken out and shuffled. So rotor number 1 could be rotor number 3 next time, and so forth. Later on, Germany increased the number of rotors by 2. So you use 3 out of 5. And there was a book that said, for today's coding, you're going to use these 3 rotors out of the set of 5 that you have. And this is an example of how messages got, I don't know, can you see my cursor? I don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, here is a keyboard, and the message goes from the keyboard directly to the rotors, and the rotors scramble it, and put it back onto a light pattern. Now, this is terribly labor intensive. Somebody has to read the original German, the plain text German. Somebody else has to type and press the button on that letter. And then someone else has to read the light that shows up. And then a fourth person has to key that into a telegraph. So it could take as many as 8 people to send a message. And the Enigma was not very fast. By the time you got all this done, it probably averaged no much more than 1 character per second. You can't send a whole lot of traffic at 1 character per second. This is what the machine looked like. Now, this is obviously a 4-rotor machine. It's a naval machine. Here is the plug board, and you set up the plugs per day basis. This is the keyboard, and this is the light panel up here. Obviously, the thing had a battery in there, and it was an electromechanical, and roughly about the size of a large typewriter, and about as heavy. Now, there was a spy that had access to the Germans, French, I should say, had a spy in Germany that had access to the German cipher materials that included daily keys that were used during 1932 and September and October. The French gave this material to the Poles. Now, they had a very bright mathematician who used this material, and he was able to discern the wiring of the rotors. Very, very complex mathematics. And he did that. He was able to solve for the unknown wiring of the Enigma. And they were able to build their own Enigma machines, and they could read the German Enigma messages. Now, the Enigma was designed to be secure, even if the internal wiring was known to an opponent. So reading encrypted messages was far from easy. And what they did, as World War II loomed, the Germans increased their complexity, and the Poles lost the ability to read the German transmissions. So they asked the help from the French and the British. And you probably heard of Alan Turing. He was the British mathematician who solved and cracked the cipher generated by the revised military Enigma. Who you probably have not heard of is Gordon Welchman. And he became an American later on and worked for MITRE Corporation and was very, very involved in the design of the military communication networks between planes and boats and headquarters and so forth. And I'd say his contributions were at least equal to Alan Turing, but very few people know about him. But he was certainly equally important, if not more important. Now, as I said, the Enigma had weaknesses. It was slow. It was labor intensive, 6 people at least, maybe 8. And it ciphered and deciphered, but did not transmit or receive. So somebody still had to get onto a telegraph key and send and receive the messages. And it could only be used to communicate from remote field units or ships at sea. Headquarters couldn't use Enigma to talk to other headquarters because of the volume of information that they needed to transmit. I want to debunk one myth because we talk about the breaking of the Enigma. The Enigma cipher was never cracked. We read the Enigmas only because of lazy and poorly trained operators and the theft of its code tables. That's very, very important. If people had used the Enigma the way it was intended to be used, and they kept the code tables secret, we would have never been able to break the Enigma. It was absolutely secure, but operators took shortcuts and they failed to follow proper procedures. Often they would use standardized phrases. For example, Heil Hitler was very, very common in many messages. And the second that you know what part of the plain text is, you have a foot up into breaking that cipher. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But let's talk about some of the flaws that the Enigma had. No letter could ever be encrypted to itself. So when you typed in the letter E, 25 other letters could come up, but not the letter E. And the other problem was encryption was reciprocal. If the letter E encrypted to the letter Z, then the letter Z would encrypt to the would encrypt to the letter E. So you only had to get half of the characters. The other half were given to you automatically because the encryption was completely reciprocal. Now, again, these are serious flaws, but taken by themselves, they would not have allowed the Enigma ciphers to be cracked. But it was operator failures and the theft of code tables that allowed the cracking. Now, there are other Enigma flaws, but they're beyond the scope of this talk, and they require an understanding of the internal construction and operation. But again, these are, without the operator flaws, these are not fatal. Now, again, for the techies here, and obviously you are, if the rotor wiring is secret, the total number of possible encryption configurations has been calculated 3 times 10 to the 114th power. That's about a 380-bit number. The number is so large that I don't think we have a name. I was never able to find a name for that number. And it's way more than the total number of atoms in the observable universe, which I have read is about 10 to the 79th atoms in the entire universe. But with known wiring and other operational constraints, it's reduced about 10 to the 23rd, which is a 76-bit number. Now, Enigmas were tactical, as I said. They were designed for field units and ships at sea, and couldn't keep up with the flow of traffic between Hitler and headquarters and between headquarters. Hitler and headquarters needed something more secure. The answer was a machine that we termed Lorenz. Lorenz was better. I believe that it did about 6 characters per second from my observing of the mechanism inside. And it was not labor intensive. One person was required, and it transmitted and enciphered in one operation. And it used 12 rotors to scramble messages versus the 3 or 4 for the Enigma. So it was theoretically much, much more secure. When I looked at the Lorenz, and again, I'm not a mechanical engineer, but I did some work on mechanics for electromechanical devices, and I think had the bandwidth of their communication lines been better, they probably could have operated that at as much as 10 characters or even slightly more. But I think the limiting factor was the bandwidth of their cables. Now, Lorenz was big, could only be used in semi-permanent facilities. It was very difficult and time-consuming to move and difficult to hook up. And as I said, it was used between Hitler and the Army Navy headquarters and between various unit headquarters. And throughout the entire war, even though there were thousands of the single ones, Lorenz, there was only 52, whereas Enigmas had thousands. Now, Lorenz carried strategic information, whereas I said Enigma carried the tactical information. You need both types in warfare. The Lorenz cipher was obviously much harder to crack, and electromechanical equipment would have been too slow to crack it. Let me diverse for a second. I didn't cover it in here, but there was a machine called the Bombe, Bombe, and the Poles named it that, and that name stuck. And Alan Turing invented a better version of it, and that's how they cracked the Enigma code. It was cracked partially by hand and partially by an electromechanical machine, which I think could do like 20 uh, uh, tests per second on the code. And later on, Gordon Welchman made the machine much, much faster through one of his inventions. But no electromechanical device could help in decrypting the Lorenz. And a guy by a name who's should be given a lot of credit, and nobody knows his name, Tommy Flowers. He worked for the British Post Office, and he invented the first electronic computer that was used to crack, I should say, the Lorenz cipher. Now, that machine was so secret that the English allowed America to take credit of inventing the first digital computer, which we call the ENIAC. In fact, the ENIAC worked 4 years after the computer that Tommy Flowers invented, and that was called Colossus. And it was invented specifically to attack the Lorenz cipher, and it was the world's first programmable computer. Its existence was kept secret for 30 years after the war. And it was so secret that Britain, as I said, even let the US take credit for the first computer. This is a picture of a reconstructed Colossus because none were allowed to exist after the war. They were all destroyed to keep the secret secret. This is a reconstructed Colossus. Now, let me divert before I go into what Americans were doing. Why was the Lorenz so secret for 30 years after the war when the Enigmas were not? Well, it turns out when Russia invaded Germany, they found all these Lorenz machines, maybe 25 or 30 of them. And while they knew we had broken the Enigma, they did not know that we had broken the Lorenz. They took those Lorenz machines back to Russia, duplicated them because they had obviously the prototypes, and they continued to use them for years without knowing that we had broken that code and we had the ability to read their messages. So that's why the Colossus was destroyed, because its secret had to be kept for as much as 30 years. I'm not going to go into any more about that, but talk about the Americans. Now, we used a crypto device similar to the Germans, but ours was much more advanced. It was called SIG-ABA. The SIG stood for signal intelligence. ABA stood for nothing. It has no meaning whatsoever. And again, it was so secret, we had to make sure that it did not end up in the hands of the Germans or the Japanese. And if a SIG-ABA unit was ever put into the field, it came equipped with a thermite bomb. For those that are not familiar with a thermite bomb doesn't explode. It simply gets hot, very hot, 3,500 degrees Celsius, which melts the machine to prevent capture. And we still use those thermite bombs on some of our top secret helicopters that we use that are invisible to radar. We don't want the enemy catching those things. And when we lost one, when we went to get Can't remember his name. But we lost one of our secret helicopters and we lit thermite bombs. So the Pakistanis could not get any part of it. Okay, to the best of our knowledge, Sagaba was never broken. It used, I believe, 15 rotors instead of the 12 that the Lorenz used. And it was the last electromechanical encryption machine in use. Obviously, today, everything is based upon electronics. Let me talk a little bit about one other thing that was always a major problem. It was a major problem during World War One, during World War Two, during the Cold War, and it has been a problem for everybody that used encryption. And that problem is key distribution. It is the Achilles heel in any crypto system. In order for you to decode the message that I send you, you have to have the key that I used. Without that key, that message is just as decipherable to you as it is to somebody who's listening. And keys should be changed very frequently because if they are not, they give the person listening a leg up in breaking your code. But there's a tremendous effort in sending keys to somebody and making sure that the key has not been compromised. Therefore, ships at sea need to have months of keys on board and able to operate for extended periods. A submarine carried enough fuel and torpedoes for about 2 months worth of tours. And therefore, they had to have at least 2 months of cipher codes on board. Well, when we captured a submarine, I don't remember the number, it was U-110, I believe, we got all their code tables for the next 2 months. And that was a problem. So this had to be solved, and it was solved in the 1960s and the 1970s. The solution was found by two different groups, at least two different groups. And the new crypto system employed two different but related keys, one to encrypt and the other one to decrypt. Now, the interesting thing is knowing one would not expose the other. If you if you knew how I encrypted something, that would not help you to decrypt it. So once a message was encrypted using the encryption key, that message would not allow anyone to decrypt the message. So therefore, I have a method of sending you a key that is completely secure because I can publish my key so that everybody knows it. You can use that key to send me a message, and I have a key that can decrypt that. You can give me your key, and I can send you that message back, giving you the key that I need that I need you to have to decrypt my messages. Let's see if I don't think that's very clear, but let me give you a simple parallel, if I could. I want to send you a message, but you don't have a key. I'm going to use a physical box, a lockbox, and that lockbox has two hasps, one on one side, one on the other side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and buy a lock. I'm going to put my message in the box. I'm going to lock the box. And now I have the only key that can open up that lock. So I send you the box through the mail. The box is locked. Nobody can open it if it's intercepted. And when you get the box, you can't open it either. Now you go out and buy a second lock, and you put a second lock on that box. Now the box has two locks on it. The first lock I have the key for. The second lock only you have the key for. Now you send that box back to me. It has two locks on it. I only have one key, but I have the key for the first lock. So I use my key to open up that lock and take it off the box. I now send that box back to you, which now has only one lock on it, your lock. When you get that box, you have the key. You can open up that box and read my message. That's a little bit kind of like how I can send a message to you and keep it private, even without sending you the key. And that, by the way, is called public key encryption system. And that is the way virtually all encryption is done today, including when you send your credit card via the internet to Amazon or whatever. They use public key encryption. And there is one company in America called RSA, and Jerry worked for them and could probably tell you 100 times more than I could hope to tell you. That concludes my talk for today. I'm going to stop sharing and go back here. And that's it. Are there any questions? None?
Thank you, Chuck.
Well, I've got a quick question. You seem really well versed in all of this. Is there any reading material that you would suggest on a good, like, book-sized overview, sort
There,
of like you gave, but much more detailed?
yes, there are so many books that I would say there's probably close to 100 that I have in my collection. Two very good ones, one, and they're both by David Kahn, Kahn. One is called The Code Breakers. And unfortunately, it was written before we knew about the some of the later stuff, and so he updated it later, and it was called. I cannot recall the name of the book, but David Kahn wrote two books, and both are considered seminal works. I think it was called Chasing the Enigma, and neither one of those covers the Lorenz because that happened much later. And there are other books that will cover the Lorenz. As I said, I have close to 100 books on cryptanalysis and cryptography. I did work at NSA just briefly back around the 70s. Um, I was employed there for a particular reason. I had a particular skill that they could have used or they did use. And in those days, there was no such agency as NSA. NSA stood for no such agency. It was not on the books, and you couldn't find anything about it. When they interviewed me and hired me, they would not tell me where I was going to work. I had to take a lie detector test every 2 years, and I worked in I guess you people know what a Faraday cage is. It is a room where you get signals cannot get out. It's shielded with a copper mesh or whatever, completely around the room. And my room that I worked in was a Faraday cage, and it was one of three Faraday cages that were connected to each other. I could only get into the second one. I have no idea what was in cage number one or cage number three. The only thing that when I had finished doing the work that my machine did, I pushed them through a hole in the wall, literally wires, and I had to know that the machine on the other end was a UNIVAC 1103 because I used Honeywell, and Honeywell used the ASCII code system, which most of us use today. But for whatever reason, UNIVAC had their own coding system, and I had to translate from ASCII to whatever UNIVAC's code was so they could understand what I sent them. But I never touched cryptography. I only touched intercept. That was what my group did. We came up with intercept capability.
It's a really good description of compartmentalized need to know. I have coworkers that currently work in a Faraday cage much in the same way. It's fascinating stuff.
It is. Oh, by the way, standing outside the door to each of these Faraday cages were two armed Marines with no sense of humor. I
Well, I
was.
think that's a definition for being a Marine.
I think you're correct. I think you're correct. I literally had to go through three checkpoints just to get into the building, to get onto the floor where I worked, and then another check. Getting into the building, I believe I used a retinal. Uh, I went through a viewer, and it checked my retinal, like a fingerprint to identify me.
So you were closer to the part of NSA that my dad didn't know he was with at the time. Uh, he was with Army Signals Agency, Vint Hill,
Right. Well, Vint Hill was
doing the intercepts.
yeah. Vint Hill was still in existence when I was at NSA. As I said, I have no idea where the data that was coming into my machine came from. Again, I didn't have a need to know that.
Yep.
They gave me dummy data that they had generated that meant nothing. I passed it through the thing that I came up with, or not me and three other people, and we were able to produce characters, and those characters were sent over to a UNIVAC 1108, which I assume did the actual analysis, cryptanalysis of that data. I had nothing to do with cryptanalysis, only the construction of characters from bits.
Yeah. And answer to the question of what UNIVAC used. The UNIVACs were using Army Signal Corps field data character representation.
Ah, okay. Luckily, there was a one-to-one table that it was a lookup table.
Yeah,
Very-
I had similar problems getting data from National Library of Medicine's IBM mainframe because it was EBCDIC as opposed to ASCII,
Right.
and it was accented EBCDIC,
Oh.
eccentrically accented EBCDIC.
Well, when I worked for Burger King, Honeywell, our parent was Pillsbury, and the only way that we could do data communications with Pillsbury for a while was by punch cards, because
Oh my God.
we
Unbelievable.
finally got RJE, got that connected. It was one of my projects.
That's interesting. Very interesting. That's it. Any more?
Yeah, I just want to mention that they couldn't read our tapes and we couldn't read theirs. So if they sent us a tape, we had to send it out to an agency to get it translated.
I had a problem like that at NASA. I had at one time 9-channel tapes. The original tapes that IBM made were 7-channel tapes, and we
Yep.
didn't have any 7-channel drives. So the same problem occurs.
I worked a little bit with deck tapes, and
Those
the
were
deck,
different.
I know those were completely different. The deck PDP-8, if you used a tape, you could actually use the tape as if it were disk.
It was a random access tape.
It was random access tape. It was
That's
running
correct.
ISAM
With-
type of a.
with block storage, formatted blocks.
That's
Yes.
correct.
30 years ago, there was a service bureau upstairs at a strip mall somewhere in Cambridge where a guy had a small VAX computer with extended bus rack, and he had an adapter to connect every known tape drive he'd ever seen. And he
Wow.
could do any tape to any tape conversion for you. And he would code a special character translation table if you needed one. And I sure needed one because National Library's EBCDIC accents weren't standard EBCDIC accents. They even had one character that wasn't yet in HTML characters 30 years ago. One of the Polish slashed ones.
Any chance that was Cambridge Computer over on Hampshire Street?
I don't remember. It could be. I mean, there wasn't need for two of them.
That's fair.
But
I
I had Ambassador Brattle Cab delivery service, which I'd used, 15 years before that, when I was an intern. So I knew they'd do that. So when I needed them, I said, "Okay, we're getting them."
They probably had to modify the entire I/O channel of the PDP-8 to be able to do put all these tape drives on there.
Well, I think the service bureau was using a VAX. Maybe it was an 11, but I think it was an early small VAX. But he'd have to modify older IBM tape drive controllers to fit on a VAX back panel. He had a profitable hobby.
I think the early VAXs were mainframe size. I think the 11s would probably be the one that would,
11s came in multiple heights, but the second
Yes.
model of VAX, the 750, was a lot shorter than the 780.
Yeah, I don't remember the model that we ran in Cambridge, but ours were the size of a garbage can and not like a kitchen garbage can. That was about as big as they got then.
Yeah, those were
they
later.
came out with a micro VAX.
Those were sweet when they came out, but they were a good bit later than the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, I'm talking about late 90s, early 2000s. So
yeah,
I had a 780.
I remember when I was at UMass Boston, my first couple of semesters, all I had were like two PDP 1134As. One of them was used for the graduate classes for like single board use, and the other everyone else had to share. And then in my third year, they brought in a VAX 11780, and that was a really sweet upgrade.
I have to tell you something very funny. Back in around 64, I was at IBM, and I had to develop a robot capable of testing. They had chips that were between a transistor and a monolithic chip. It was called SLT, Solid Logic Technology, and I think they could have 4 or 6 transistors on a chip. And I didn't have anything to do with the robot. That was done by a separate group. But my job was to build the computer that could drive that and do the compiler to compile from the test language into the ones and zeros for the tester. And what did they give me for a computer to do that? A 1401. Yeah, I had to modify one of the I/O channels that talks to the punch. I did not have a punch on that machine. I had to pull out the I/O channel and modify it so that it was compatible with the robot. So,
yeah. Well, thank you for mentioning Gordon Welchman's later life. I keep forgetting that when I was at MITRE, nobody told me that he'd been affiliated with the Washington branch office. Not even our mathematician cryptographer that taught us a cryptography class. It may have still been quiet. It was quite a while ago, but
Yeah.
if I'd known he was in our Virginia office, if he was still there when the one time I visited the Virginia office, I'd have looked for him.
Yeah, he was a very brilliant, brilliant man.
Yeah.
That a gentleman? Take my leave of you, and hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Been
Okay,
excellent.
It was great.
We'll see you on
Thanks, Chuck.
Friday, Chuck.
Excuse me, Jerry.
See you on Friday.
Take it easy, guys. Have a good one.
Yeah,
Bye
take care.
bye.
You too.
Right.
Thanks.